I've meant to make this video for just under a year, but I thought of the idea last year just as Pride Month ended. I nearly forgot once again this year, and that's why I'm posting this video one day after Pride. I personally think it's very important to know that the LGBTQ or GRSM community has a history of acceptance in many places, and it is not a modern idea slowly becoming normalized, but a suppressed way of life by xenophobic societies that have dominated recent history. This history doesn't solely include homosexual relationships either, as many understandings of people and gender by certain societies was not binary, as most modern societies proclaim them to be. But, for those in the LGBTQ GRSM community that may come across this video, please don't take this as me telling you your own history. It's more for people who may not be as involved or as well versed, as most of my videos are, and this video was made with nothing but respect for the community. Also, this history is quite Eurocentric, simply due to Europe being the source of most nations' homophobic tendencies. I personally find that historians and archaeologists look at many obvious homosexual depictions and try to find any and every other possibility before admitting that homosexuality is even a likelihood. Although there are many things we don't and can't understand about past societies and cultures due to a lack of concrete evidence, we can't entirely exclude the idea. The first evidence seen is Sicilian Mesolithic cave paintings depicting several male couples in homosexual acts. This is important, as these people of Sicily had to have seen these relationships as important enough to their culture to paint on cave walls. Meanwhile, our first evidence of a possible transgender individual is found in Prague, as a male buried in female attire. There had been statues showing individuals with both typically male and female characteristics found in the Mediterranean, but this is the first evidence of humans partaking. We now turn our attention to Egypt, where we find a tomb with the first concrete individuals in a homosexual relationship. These men are named Khnumhotep and Ninkhnum, and in several paintings they are depicted embracing, or with one of the men in positions commonly reserved for a wife. These men are considered the first homosexual couple, as before, the images painted on walls and statues didn't seem to represent anyone directly, and rather a general acceptance of the practice. In the Indian epic Mahabharata, two individuals are said to be transgendered. One of the individuals, Sikandi, born a female, transitioned to be male in early life, and would go on to fight in a great war alongside his father and brother. The other individual was part of an exiled group of people who were forced from their homes for 12 years, and the 13th year these people had to spend in disguise. For this 13th year, Arjuna disguised as a female, Brihanala, and taught a queen's daughter to dance. Arjuna did transition back after the year was over, but on several other occasions they would transition back to be Brihanala, which may suggest the idea that gender was more of a spectrum rather than a binary set. But now there is a turning point in history. As in Zoroastrianism, a widespread ancient religion, homosexuality becomes a sin. Those who partake in these acts can be killed, which cemented a culture of hatred towards LGBT people supported by texts of this faith. Zoroastrianism dominated a vast area, and many religions branched off, such as Judaism, and carried with them many of the former rules of Zoroastrian faith, such as the condemnation of homosexuals. Much of the modern stigma against the LGBTQ community can be stemmed from the Zoroastrian hate perpetuated by the laws passed down from religion to religion. Although Greece was on the fringe of this hateful religion, sexual liberty prospered within the region as we see the practice of pederasty begin to normalize. Pederasty is the practice where an older male would take on a younger male as a sort of apprentice that he would mentor and teach, with the end goal of making the younger male an outstanding citizen of Greek society, through the teachings of the older male. This often flourished into a sexual relationship between the men. Also around this time, we see a prolific poet, Sappho, writing many works with undeniable homoerotic themes. She is so associated with these themes that the term lesbian derives from the island on which she was born, Lesbos. Now in India, many texts begin to reference a third gender, known as Hijra, of those who identify as neither male nor female. Typically a Hijra is born a man, and dons characteristics of both a man and a woman, and usually lives in communities with other Hijra. Meanwhile in Han China, emperor after emperor were said to be bisexual or even homosexual, and in the general dynasty, it wasn't deemed illegal or immoral either. Now, as the Roman Empire rose, homosexual relations between men were seen as natural and were not punishable by law. However, it was shameful to be the passive partner in male-male intercourse, as it was seen as childish or weak. This led to most male-male relationships being those of a Roman citizen dominant male and a non-Roman passive male. However, lesbianism was not as accepted, as no matter who was the dominant partner, it was seen to break too far from traditional gender roles expected of Roman women. There is now a period of general prosperity and acceptance of gay relationships in the Roman Empire, with many high-ranking officials having said to partake in the relationships, and many works of literature and poems referencing homosexuality are published. Gay marriages, although not officially recognized by the government, were practiced by many. These unions were not widely accepted by the public, but not illegal in any sense, with the Emperor Nero marrying a man himself. Another Roman emperor, Elagabalus, enjoyed adorning makeup and being called his husband's wife. He even offered a reward to anyone who would be able to conduct surgery for him to have a vagina, which is the first record in history of an individual requesting surgery to change their birth sex. But this acceptance came to an end as Christianity became more prominent in the Roman Empire. As Christianity came from and embraced many parts of Judaism, homosexuality was widely rejected and seen as a reprehensible sin. The legalization of Christianity is a major turning point in the history of LGBTQ rights, as slowly the faith would engulf politics and create new laws criminalizing homosexuality throughout the empire. In one instance, Egyptian pagan priests were slaughtered for their open femininity and homosexuality in suppression of sexual and religious freedoms. Campaigns like this would continue, beginning a dark age for homosexual rights in the Western world, as homophobia became entrenched in European society. This primarily from the Romans, but also permeating into other European tribal nations. However, in Japan, homosexuality was embraced, as seen by many paintings and literary texts, with Japan having similar pederasty practices to ancient Greece, with a younger male apprenticing under an older, more mature male. Also, in Melanesia, several tribes develop a culture of heterophobia, with heterosexual acts being done only for procreation. A famous example being the Utoro people, who believed that heterosexuality shortened lifespan. All of a sudden in the Middle East, homoerotic texts spring up in a frenzy, suggesting a societal acceptance of the practices. The sudden change is often attributed to the Abbasid Revolution, where the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyad Caliphate. This culture of acceptance was looked upon disdainfully by Europe, who would often translate Arabic texts depicting homosexuality to be heterosexual. This to the confusion of many Muslim travelers. There was a spike in persecutions of homosexuals as the Spanish reclaimed the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim Caliphate. Under the Caliphate, as in the Middle East, homosexuality was free to practice, and so, many formerly legal homosexual people were killed by the Reconquista. Another benchmark in the spread of homophobia arises with the beginning of the Age of Exploration. This marks the beginning of westernization throughout the world, as Europe dominates most land and global politics. As Europeans began to interact with Native Americans, they were horrified to find that most, if not all indigenous people, were accepting of any form of LGBTQ+, as the indigenous religions promoted that all life is sacred. This meant any individual with sexual preference other than heterosexual was accepted, and the acceptance of the idea that gender is a spectrum with no clear boundaries between male and female. However, as the Europeans came along, indigenous people were forced into the European mindset of binary, concrete gender through subjugation and residential schools. While many of these non-gender conforming indigenous people were killed en masse, or re-educated by their oppressors. Also in Africa, these values were imposed on the local people, which made homophobia entrenched in African societies, and in South Asia, Hijra were suppressed and attacked by the British. To them, the Hijra were proof that Indian society needed the English as a civilized ruler. Despite the hate in Europe, many prominent figures are later discovered to have secretly been homosexual, such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Shakespeare, all of whom rebelled against social norms by secretly engaging in these acts. In Europe, we now see a wave of decriminalization of homosexuality, with France, Belgium, Monaco, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg all changing laws due to France's First Revolution. However, this wasn't as great as it seemed, as after years of stigmatization and criminality of homosexual behaviors, it was still seen by the public as shameful, and marriages were not accepted as legitimate by states. This wasn't a global trend though, as Japan, under threat of Western domination, adopted many Western ways of life and laws, leading to Japan's criminalization of homosexuality. The Keikan Code, as it was called, that criminalized homosexuality was soon repealed after public outcry against it and general modernization during the Meiji Restoration. South America saw a wave of decriminalization as well, with large nations such as Brazil and Argentina deeming homosexuality legal, despite the history of their colonizers being horrid in their treatment of LGBT people. A culture of homophobia began to pierce through Chinese society, with the acceptance of Western values after their loss in the Opium Wars. This made criminalizing the practice easy. Throughout Europe and North America, many gay and trans bars began to make up a part of nightlife. These would be raided if found by police, arresting many, often on charges of sodomy. After the First World War, the Soviet Union had no overarching homophobic laws, but never did anything to normalize the practices. So many Soviet socialist republics such as Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan maintained homophobic laws which perpetuated homophobia throughout the USSR. And as Nazism rises in Germany, homosexuals are targeted as a people needed to be exterminated from the perfect Aryan race. They used homosexuality to arrest many political opponents, as there were no associated physical features of being gay, and so anyone could be arrested on only accusations. Once the Second World War ended, there was a new wave of decriminalization globally, with many important countries such as the UK, Canada, Thailand, and Sweden legalizing homosexuality. However, in the United States, homophobia ran deep in American culture, and only heightened with the fear of communism, as disrupting the social order was seen as an undermining of the American way of life, and communist in nature. The Cold War began a horrible period of time for homosexual Americans, whose persecution was ramped up, supported by the state. Homosexuality was even accepted by many American doctors as a mental disorder, and so, shock therapy and other sorts of torture were used to try and fix homosexuals. And as America entered a period of civil unrest, with the civil rights, anti-war, and women's rights movements, this seemed like the perfect time for the LGBTQ community to join the fray with their own movement demanding rights. This culminated in a turning point for LGBT rights in America, as police raided a gay bar known as Stonewall. As the raid occurred, many people from other gay bars and bystanders converged outside Stonewall. Many in the bar were arrested, but seeing the horrific treatment of these gay and trans people riled up the crowd. Decades of oppression and hate finally boiled over as glasses, stones, and many other projectiles were thrown at police. Several days of clashes followed, with many arrested and injured. The pain the LGBTQ community felt over this event birthed the gay liberation movement that advocated for gay rights and saw mass public support. It also sparked vocal defiance, as the LGBTQ community was finally sick and tired of having to hide their identity in the shadows, and wanted to be themselves, always. In the following years, many scientists globally agreed that homosexuality is not a mental disorder, but a natural human behavior experienced by some. Transsexuality also sees some victories, as Sweden legalizes gender changes and provides government-subsidized hormones to those who want to transition, while Chile allows the same, but lacks the hormonal support by the government for transitioning. But now the AIDS crisis arose globally, and as it seemed to disproportionately affect gay men, it was known as gay plague, or gay cancer in America, which fueled a wave of homophobia, counter to the global trend of acceptance. Many explain this as retribution for acceptance of the gay community by God. These sentiments were somewhat echoed by the United States government at the time, as it took over a year after the classification of the disease as AIDS for the president to even say the name, let alone take action to prevent the spread. The inaction sparked another wave of protests against the homophobic government of the United States, but now there was more fuel to the fire, as people now felt that they were fighting for their lives. Slowly, state by state, the criminality of homosexuality was repealed. But, before that was achieved nationwide in the United States, 2 countries had legalized same-sex marriages, the Netherlands and Belgium. Recognition of same-sex marriage was the natural next step for the LGBTQ community in countries that had legalized homosexuality. And we are still in the process of this legalization, as every year new countries pass laws recognizing the union of same-sex couples. Yet, there are many enclaves of homophobic countries primarily in Africa and the Middle East that remain strong in their anti-gay beliefs. And even in some places that have legalized homosexual behavior, a social stigma remains perpetuated by governments and people. One of the best examples is Russia, which is deeply entrenched in homophobia, with many laws making depictions of homosexual behavior in pop culture illegal, while other nations take steps in the right direction, as China, the nation with the world's largest population, works towards legalization of same-sex marriage. However good your own situation seems where you're living, we all must realize that the fight isn't over. Many countries maintain discriminatory laws against the LGBTQ+ community, or maintain systematically oppressive institutions. The battle for equal rights is far from over, and in recognition of this, I've linked various resources in the description in ways you can support the dream of equality.